The phone speaker sat between the scissors and the foam, and my manager's voice filled the barbershop like poison gas. I'd come in for a Saturday fade, something clean for Monday's client presentation, and now I was frozen in the chair while Derek held his phone out like evidence at a crime scene. The audio kept playing, my manager's voice, casual and cold, explaining to someone how he planned to pin a budget disaster on me and terminate me right after I delivered next week's report. My chest tightened, but my face stayed still, the way it always did when white men at the office made their little jokes about urban professionals or asked if I played basketball. Derek's hand was steady, but his eyes were sharp in the mirror, watching me process what we both just heard. My name is Ezra Cole, and this is my story. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the country you're watching from. It really helps me bring you more great stories. The message had come through an hour ago, he said. A voicemail sent to the wrong number, probably meant for someone else on the management team. My manager, Gerald Pritchard, had been Derek's client for 2 years, always tipped poorly and talked loud about his bonuses. Derek had recognized my name immediately because I'd mentioned Pritchard before, complained about him taking credit for my pricing models and my client retention strategies while I stayed at the same salary for 18 months. Now Pritchard's voice was laying it all out. The fabricated expense report, the missing approvals he'd never logged, the way he'd blamed the junior analyst for sloppy oversight and protect himself with executive distance. He even laughed at one point, a dry chuckle that made my stomach turn, and said something about cleaning house before the audit. I sat there while Derek finished the fade, his clippers humming against my skull, and I didn't say a word. My mind was already moving, sorting through every email I'd sent, every budget spreadsheet I'd version controlled, every Slack message where Pritchard had explicitly approved expenses that were now supposedly my fault. I'd been carrying that department for 3 years, fixing his mistakes, covering his gaps, translating his vague instructions into actual deliverables while he schmoozed clients and played golf with the VP. Everyone knew it, but no one said it, because that's how it works when you're 27 and black and hungry in a firm that smiles at diversity but promotes legacy. Pritchard had promised me senior analyst twice, then hired his fraternity brother's son instead, told me I needed more seasoning, while that kid asked me how to build pivot tables. Derek turned off the clippers and met my eyes in the mirror. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't offer platitudes or advice, just handed me his phone and said I should record it before Pritchard realized his mistake and deleted the message from wherever he'd sent it. I pulled out my own phone, hit record, and played the voicemail through twice, capturing every second of his smug confession. The barbershop was quiet except for the low buzz of the TV in the corner and the hum of the AC unit. 2 other customers were waiting, but Derek had stopped working, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching me like he knew this moment mattered. I finished recording, checked the file, backed it up to 3 different cloud services, then looked at Derek and nodded once. He didn't smile, just handed me a towel and brushed the loose hair off my shoulders. I paid him, added an extra 20 to the tip, and walked out into the bright Atlanta afternoon with my phone heavy in my pocket and my head suddenly clear. The rage was there, burning under my ribs, but it was controlled now, focused, sharp as the edge Derek had just cut into my hairline. Pritchard thought he was protected, thought I was just another expendable body he could discard when the numbers didn't add up, but he'd made a mistake. He'd left evidence. And I'd spent 3 years building a paper trail he didn't even know existed, because I'd learned early that in corporate America, a black man's word against a white manager's smile meant nothing unless you had receipts. I drove home slowly, windows down, letting the summer heat roll through the car while I thought. Monday's presentation was 2 days away, enough time to pull everything I needed, organize it, make it airtight. Pritchard wanted to use that meeting to destroy me in front of the client, to position himself as the fixer and me as the liability, but he didn't know I'd been documenting every approval, every directive, every budget amendment he'd signed off on with his own digital signature. The client was a logistics firm worth $8 million a year in fees, and they didn't tolerate incompetence or dishonesty. If I played this right, if I stayed calm and let the facts speak, I could expose Pritchard without ever raising my voice. I could let him hang himself with his own arrogance. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the plan was already forming. I wouldn't confront him directly, wouldn't give him a chance to spin the story or rally his allies in management. I'd prepare the presentation exactly as requested, with one addition: a forensic breakdown of every expense he was planning to blame me for, complete with timestamps, approval chains, and his own written authorizations. I'd present it to the client as a transparency measure, a show of good faith and accountability, and I'd let them draw their own conclusions when they saw Pritchard's name all over the decisions he was about to disown. It was cold, methodical, the kind of revenge that didn't require anger, just precision. And I had a few days to make it perfect. Sunday morning, I woke up at 6 and made coffee in the dark, standing at my kitchen counter with my laptop already open. The voicemail was still on my phone, backed up and encrypted, and I played it one more time just to make sure I hadn't imagined the contempt in Pritchard's voice. I hadn't. He'd been specific about the timeline. Wait until after the presentation, let me deliver the projections and field the tough questions, then call me into his office Friday afternoon with HR and a severance packet. He'd even mentioned the dollar amount, laughably low, and joked about how I'd probably take it because guys like him don't make waves. I set the phone down and opened my email archive, 3 years of correspondence organized by project and client, and started pulling every thread that connected to the Meridian Logistics account. The budget discrepancy he planned to pin on me was real: $73,000 in overruns across Q2 and Q3, spread between vendor contracts, software licensing, and consultant fees. On paper, it looked sloppy, the kind of thing that happened when a junior analyst got over-eager and didn't watch the margins. But I'd flagged every single expense in real time, sent approval requests through the proper channels, and received written authorization from Pritchard or his proxy before processing anything. I pulled the receipts: 42 emails, 16 Slack threads, and 9 digital signatures on procurement forms. Every overrun had been his decision, usually made under pressure from the client or from his own boss, and I'd documented each one with the careful paranoia of someone who'd seen too many black colleagues thrown under the bus for white managers' mistakes. I built a spreadsheet that Sunday, color-coded and merciless. Column A, expense description. Column B, amount. Column C, date of approval. Column D, approving authority. Column E, supporting documentation. I hyperlinked every cell in column E to the original email or message thread, creating a digital paper trail that was impossible to dispute. By noon, I had a master file that told the whole story: how Pritchard had pushed for premium services to impress the client, how he'd authorized rush fees to meet his own deadlines, how he'd personally signed off on consultant rates that were 15% above market because he didn't want to negotiate. The numbers were clean, the timeline was airtight, and his name was on everything. I took a break around 2, went for a run through the neighborhood, let my mind settle. The August heat was thick, the kind that made your lungs work harder, and I pushed through 5 miles without music, just the sound of my breathing and the rhythm of my feet on pavement. When I got back, I showered, ate, and returned to the laptop with fresh eyes. The presentation for Monday was already 90% done. I'd finished the client-facing slides on Friday, all the growth projections and market analysis Pritchard would take credit for. Now I added a new section, buried in the appendix, labeled Budget Reconciliation and Approval Documentation. It looked like a boring administrative attachment, the kind of thing clients usually skipped, but it contained everything: the expense breakdown, the approval chain, the timeline of decisions. I formatted it professionally, made it look like standard due diligence, and saved 3 versions in case I needed to pivot. That evening, I sat on my couch and thought about who Pritchard had been talking to in that voicemail. He'd addressed someone by name, called them man, spoke with the casual confidence of someone who expected agreement and complicity. The name had been garbled in the recording, something that sounded like Marcus, or maybe Martin, but the tone suggested familiarity. maybe even friendship. I scrolled through the company directory in my head, cross-referenced it with people who had reason to want me gone or who stood to benefit from my termination. There were a few possibilities. Marcus Hale in operations, who'd applied for the same analyst position I'd gotten 3 years ago and never let it go. Martin Schaefer in finance, who'd clashed with me over reporting methods and didn't like being corrected. Both were friendly with Pritchard, both played golf at the same country club, both had the kind of soft-handed resentment that festered in corporate spaces. I made a note to watch them during the presentation, to see who reacted when the budget section came up, who looked at Pritchard for cues. If one of them was in on it, they'd give themselves away with a glance or a hesitation, and I'd know who else to keep in my sights. For now, though, the focus had to stay on Pritchard. He was the architect of this setup, the one with the authority to destroy me, and taking him down would handle the rest. I'd learned that lesson from my father, who'd spent 30 years as a union electrician in Baltimore and taught me that you don't fight every battle. You fight the one that matters. Pritchard mattered. He was the test of whether I'd survive in this industry or become another cautious story about a smart kid who didn't know how to protect himself. I spent the rest of Sunday rehearsing the presentation in my head, timing each section, anticipating questions from the client, imagining Pritchard's face when I casually referenced the appendix and suggested we walk through the approval process for transparency. I wouldn't ambush him. That would look emotional, unprofessional, like I had an agenda. Instead, I'd present it as a courtesy, a way to give the client full visibility into how we manage their account, and I'd let the numbers do the talking. If Pritchard interrupted or tried to redirect, I'd defer politely and keep going, letting his panic build while I stayed composed. The client would see the contrast, me, prepared and factual, him, defensive and scrambling, and that contrast would tell them everything they needed to know. By the time I went to bed, the plan was locked in. I set my alarm for 5:30, laid out my suit, and put my laptop bag by the door. The voicemail was still on my phone, an insurance policy I hoped I wouldn't need, but I kept it close anyway. Sleep came slowly, my mind running through contingencies and fallback positions. But when it finally arrived, it was deep and dreamless. I'd done the work. Now I just had to execute. Monday morning, I walked into the office at 7:45, earlier than usual, and the floor was still half empty. The building was downtown, glass and steel, the kind of place that looked impressive in recruitment brochures but felt cold when you worked there every day. I went straight to my desk, logged in, and pulled up the presentation one last time, checking every slide, every hyperlink, every footnote in the appendix. My hands were steady. I'd woken up calm, almost detached, the way I used to feel before college basketball games when the pressure was high and the noise didn't matter. This was just another performance, another moment where preparation met opportunity, and I'd spent 3 years preparing for something I didn't even know was coming. Pritchard arrived at 8:30 carrying his usual Starbucks venti and talking loud on his phone about a tea time. He walked past my desk without acknowledging me, just a vague nod in my direction like I was furniture, and disappeared into his office. Through the glass wall, I watched him settle in, adjust his monitor, laugh at something on his screen. He looked relaxed, confident, probably running through his own version of today's meeting where he'd shine in front of the client and I'd serve as his technical support. He had no idea I'd heard his voice on Saturday, no idea the trap he'd set for me was about to spring backward. I turned back to my monitor and opened Slack, scrolling through the last month of team messages, looking for anything else I might have missed. At 9, Marcus Hale stopped by my desk with coffee and a tight smile. He was mid-30s, pale, always dressed like he was trying too hard. Crisp shirts with cufflinks, expensive shoes that looked uncomfortable. He asked how I was feeling about the presentation, said he'd heard it was a big one, and I told him I was ready. His eyes lingered on my screen for a second, like he was trying to read what I was working on, and I minimized the window casually, kept my face neutral. He laughed, said something about pressure-making diamonds, and walked away. I watched him go, noticed how he glanced toward Pritchard's office before heading to his own cube, and filed that observation away. Marcus was involved. I didn't know how deep, but he was part of the plan. The client meeting was scheduled for 11 in the main conference room, the one with the long table and the view of the city that made everyone feel important. I printed backup copies of the presentation, loaded the file onto 3 different devices in case of technical failures, and rehearsed my opening lines while I waited. At 10:45, Pritchard emerged from his office, tie slightly loosened, and told me to head up early to set up the equipment. I nodded, grabbed my materials, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The conference room was empty and bright, sunlight pouring through the windows, and I connected my laptop to the projector, tested the clicker, arranged the printed decks at each seat. Everything was perfect. I sat down at the far end of the table, away from the head where Pritchard would sit, and waited. The Meridian logistics team arrived at 11 sharp. 3 people, led by Janet Mosley, their CFO, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd built their company from a regional carrier into a national player. She had a reputation for asking hard questions and not tolerating excuses, and I'd worked with her directly on several projects, earned her respect by being thorough and honest. She greeted me by name, shook my hand firmly, and asked if we were ready. I told her we were. Pritchard came in 2 minutes later with our VP, Dale Fenton, who rarely attended client meetings but liked to show face when big accounts were involved. Pritchard took his seat at the head of the table, smiled at everyone, and started with his usual charm offensive, thanking Meridian for their partnership, praising their growth, talking about our shared vision for the next fiscal year. I let him talk, watching the room, noting how Janet's assistant was taking notes on a tablet and how Janet herself was scanning the printed deck, flipping through pages with the focused attention of someone who actually read the details. When Pritchard finally turned to me and said, "Ezra's going to walk us through the numbers," I stood up smoothly, picked up the clicker, and began. My voice was even, professional, no hesitation. I walked them through the market analysis first, showing how Meridian's expansion into the Southeast had outpaced projections and created new opportunities for operational efficiency. Janet nodded, asked 2 clarifying questions, and I answered both without referring to notes. Pritchard sat back looking pleased, probably thinking this was going exactly as he'd planned. Then I moved to the budget review, and the room's energy shifted. I brought up the expense summary, showed the total spend for Q2 and Q3, and acknowledged the overruns clearly. I said we wanted to be transparent about where the additional costs had come from, that accountability was important for maintaining trust, and I suggested we review the approval documentation to ensure everyone understood the decision-making process. Janet leaned forward, interested now, and Pritchard's smile faltered just slightly. I advanced to the appendix and the screen filled with my color-coded spreadsheet, every expense linked to its approval, every signature visible and dated. I walked through it methodically, referencing specific emails and procurement forms, showing how each overrun had been authorized in writing by senior management. Pritchard's face changed. He sat up straighter, glanced at Dale, then back at me, and I saw the moment he realized what I was doing. But he couldn't interrupt, not without looking defensive or unprepared, so he stayed quiet while I continued. I pointed out consultant fees he'd approved to accelerate deliverables, software licensing he'd signed off on to meet integration deadlines, vendor contracts he'd negotiated personally to secure premium service. Every decision had his name on it. Every authorization came from his desk, and I presented it all without emotion, just facts and dates and digital receipts. Janet's expression hardened as she followed along, and her assistant stopped typing, just staring at the screen. When I finished, the room was silent. I set down the clicker, returned to my seat, and waited. Janet looked at Pritchard, then at Dale, and asked quietly who had final approval authority on the Meridian account. Dale said it was Pritchard as the managing director. Janet nodded slowly, flipped back through her printed deck, and circled something with her pen. Then she looked at me and said, "Thank you, Ezra. This is exactly the kind of transparency we value." Pritchard tried to recover, started talking about oversight and process improvements, but his voice had lost its confidence, and Janet cut him off mid-sentence. She said they'd need to discuss this internally and asked if we could schedule a follow-up later in the week. Dale agreed immediately, and the meeting ended 10 minutes early. As Meridian's team filed out, Janet caught my eye and nodded once, a small gesture that felt like acknowledgement. I packed up my laptop and left the conference room without looking at Pritchard. I went back to my desk and sat there, hands flat on the surface, breathing slowly while the adrenaline drained out of my system. The office around me hummed with its usual Monday energy, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, someone microwaving fish in the break room, but I felt separate from it, enclosed in the quiet space that comes after you've done something you can't take back. I'd exposed Pritchard in front of the client and our VP, laid out his incompetence and dishonesty with surgical precision, and there was no walking it back now. Either I'd just saved my job or I'd accelerated my termination, and I wouldn't know which until someone called me into an office. Pritchard didn't come out of the conference room for 20 minutes. When he finally appeared, walking fast toward the elevators with Dale beside him, his face was red and his jaw was tight. He didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone, just disappeared behind the closing elevator doors while Dale's expression stayed carefully neutral. The floor felt different after they left, like everyone sensed something had shifted but didn't know what. Marcus walked past my desk twice in 15 minutes, each time slowing down like he wanted to say something, but I kept my eyes on my screen and he kept moving. I opened my email and started working through my backlog, routine project updates and data requests, acting like nothing had happened. At 1:30, Dale's assistant called my extension and asked me to come to his office on 16. My stomach tightened, but I stood up, straightened my tie, and took the stairs instead of the elevator, giving myself time to think. Dale's office was corner suite territory, big windows and furniture that cost more than my car, and when I walked in, he was standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city. He turned when I entered, gestured to one of the leather chairs across from his desk, and sat down across from me instead of behind the desk, which felt significant. His expression was unreadable. Not angry, not friendly, just evaluating. He asked me how long I'd been working on the Meridian account, and I told him 2.5 years since the initial pitch. He asked if I'd built most of the analysis and projections, and I said yes, with Pritchard providing strategic direction. Dale smiled faintly at that, like he appreciated the diplomacy, and then he asked me directly if I'd known the budget documentation would create a problem for Pritchard. I looked him in the eye and said I'd included it because I thought transparency was appropriate given the cost overruns, that I wanted the client to understand our approval process and see that we took accountability seriously. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth, and Dale knew it. He studied me for a moment, then nodded and said he appreciated my thoroughness. He told me Janet Mosley had called him personally after the meeting, said she was concerned about the oversight failures and wanted to understand who was actually managing her account day to day. She'd specifically asked about my role and whether I had direct authority, which told me everything I needed to know about how she'd interpreted the presentation. Dale said the firm would be conducting an internal review of the Meridian budget and that I should expect to be interviewed by our compliance team later in the week. He asked if I had any concerns about the review process, and I said no, that I was confident the documentation would speak for itself. Dale watched me carefully when I said that, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not quite respect, but recognition, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. Before I left, he told me to take the rest of the day off, said I'd done good work on the presentation and should decompress. It wasn't a suggestion, so I thanked him and walked out, taking the elevator down to the lobby instead of returning to my desk. The afternoon was bright and hot, the downtown streets crowded with lunch traffic, and I walked 4 blocks to a park near the river and sat on a bench in the shade. My phone buzzed twice with Slack messages from coworkers asking if I was okay, but I didn't respond. I just sat there, watching the water and the joggers and the business people cutting through on their way to meetings, and let myself feel what I'd been holding back all morning. I'd done it. I'd exposed Pritchard without losing my composure, documented his failures so thoroughly that he couldn't spin the narrative, and positioned myself as the competent professional while he scrambled to explain his own approvals. The risk was real. He could still try to fire me, could claim I'd undermined him or acted insubordinately, could rally his allies in management to protect himself. But I'd given Dale and the client a clear choice: believe the documented facts or believe Pritchard's excuses. And in corporate America, when a black analyst has receipts and a white manager has excuses, the receipts usually win, not because of justice, but because of liability. The firm couldn't afford to look incompetent or dishonest in front of an $8 million client, which meant they couldn't afford to protect Pritchard if it cost them Meridian. I stayed in the park until 3, then walked to my car and drove home slowly, windows down, radio off. My apartment felt different when I walked in, quieter somehow, like the space had changed shape while I was gone. I changed out of my suit, made a sandwich I didn't eat, and opened my laptop on the couch. The voicemail was still there, backed up and encrypted, and I played it one more time just to remind myself why I'd done this. Pritchard's voice filled my living room, casual and cruel, planning my destruction like it was a minor administrative task, and I felt the anger return, cold and focused. He'd tried to erase me, to use my work against me and then discard me like I was disposable, and he'd done it with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences before. But he'd made a mistake. He'd underestimated me, assumed I was just another junior analyst who'd accept his fate quietly, and that assumption had left a trail of evidence I'd spent 3 years collecting without even knowing I'd need it. Now the evidence was out there, in front of the client and our VP, and Pritchard couldn't take it back or explain it away. All I had to do was wait, stay calm, and let the system grind forward. The review would confirm what I'd presented. Janet would push for accountability, and Dale would make the calculation that protecting me was cheaper than losing Meridian. It wasn't justice, it was leverage, but leverage was enough. Tuesday, I came in early again before most of the team arrived and found an email from HR waiting in my inbox. The subject line was Compliance Review, Meridian Logistics Account, and the message was formal and brief. I was requested to meet with Linda Vasquez from Internal Audit at 10 a.m., Conference Room 3B, to discuss documentation related to budget management and approval processes. I forwarded the email to my personal account, backed up my entire Meridian folder to an external drive, and made copies of everything I might need. If this was going to be a formal investigation, I wanted to be ready for any question they could ask. The morning crawled. I worked on other projects, responded to client emails, and avoided the break room where I could hear Pritchard's voice holding court with some of the senior staff. He sounded normal, confident, like yesterday's meeting hadn't happened or didn't matter, and I wondered if he was that good at performing or if he genuinely believed he could still control the narrative. Marcus stopped by my desk at 9:30, asked if I'd heard anything about a budget situation, and I told him I was meeting with audit later and wasn't sure what it was about. He nodded slowly, tried to read my expression, and walked away looking uncomfortable. I watched him head toward Pritchard's office, knock once, and go inside. The door closed behind him. At 10, I walked down to 3B with my laptop and a folder of printed documentation. Linda Vasquez was already there, mid-40s, professional, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of finding discrepancies in people's stories. She introduced herself, asked me to sit, and opened a laptop that mirrored what looked like the same spreadsheet I'd presented to Meridian. She told me the firm took budget management seriously and wanted to understand the approval process for the overruns on the account. Her tone was neutral, not accusatory, and I realized she was treating this as fact-finding, not discipline. That was a good sign. I walked her through everything, starting from the initial contract with Meridian and moving chronologically through each expense decision. I showed her email chains where Pritchard had approved consultant rates, Slack threads where he'd authorized rush fees, procurement forms with his digital signature approving software licensing upgrades. For every claim I made, I had documentation, time-stamped, version-controlled, backed up across multiple platforms. Linda took notes in a spiral pad, asked clarifying questions about chain of command and who had final authority, and cross-referenced my answers against what looked like her own audit trail. The interview lasted 90 minutes, and by the end, she'd filled 6 pages with notes. Before I left, she asked me directly if I'd experienced any pressure from management to process expenses without proper approval, or if I'd ever been instructed to circumvent normal procurement procedures. I told her no, that every expense had gone through the proper channels and received written authorization from the managing director. She made a note of that, thanked me for my cooperation, and said I'd hear from HR once the review was complete. I stood up, shook her hand, and walked out feeling like I'd just testified in a trial where the verdict was already decided. Linda hadn't found anything wrong with my process because there was nothing wrong. Pritchard had hung himself with his own approvals. I went back to my desk and worked through lunch trying to stay focused on routine tasks while my mind kept circling back to the investigation. Around 2, Dale's assistant called again and asked me to come up to 16, this time to Dale's conference room instead of his office. When I arrived, Dale was there with our general counsel, Patricia Monroe, a woman I'd only met twice in 3 years. Patricia was senior leadership, the kind of executive who only got involved when legal exposure was on the table, and her presence told me this had escalated beyond a simple budget review. Dale gestured for me to sit, and Patricia opened a leather portfolio that looked expensive and deliberate. She told me the firm had completed a preliminary review of the Meridian account and found significant irregularities in the approval process, specifically related to expenses that had been authorized outside of normal procurement thresholds without proper executive oversight. She said the firm took these matters seriously and was implementing additional controls to prevent similar issues in the future. Then she looked at me directly and said my documentation had been exemplary, that I'd followed proper procedure throughout, and that the firm appreciated my professionalism during a difficult client presentation. It was a carefully worded statement that didn't mention Pritchard by name, but the implication was clear. They'd found him liable, not me. Dale leaned forward and said Meridian had requested a follow-up meeting for Thursday and had specifically asked that I lead the discussion. He said this was an opportunity to rebuild client confidence and demonstrate our commitment to transparency, and he wanted me to prepare an operational review that showed how we were addressing the budget issues. I agreed, keeping my expression neutral even though I felt the power shift happening in real time. Pritchard was being sidelined, I was being elevated, and the firm was managing its liability by promoting the person with clean documentation over the person who'd created the mess. It was corporate damage control, not justice, but I'd take it. Patricia asked if I had any concerns about moving forward with the Meridian relationship, any reservations about taking a more visible role on the account. I told her I was committed to delivering excellent work for the client and maintaining the standards that had built our partnership. She nodded, made a note in her portfolio, and said HR would follow up with me later in the week regarding role adjustments and compensation review. That phrase hung in the air, compensation review, and I realized they were preparing to promote me, probably to keep me quiet and keep Meridian happy, but also because I'd proven I was the one actually running the account. Dale smiled slightly, like he was pleased with how this was resolving, and dismissed me with a handshake that felt more like a colleague than a subordinate. I walked back to my desk with my heart pounding under my ribs, the kind of adrenaline that comes from winning something you didn't know was a competition. Pritchard's office door was closed, his lights off, and I wondered if he was even in the building, or if they'd already told him to stay home while they decided his fate. The floor felt different now. People glanced at me as I passed, some with curiosity, some with what looked like respect, and I understood that word had spread about the Meridian meeting and its aftermath. I was no longer invisible, no longer the junior analyst who did good work in silence. I was the person who'd stood up in front of a client and told the truth, and that changed everything. Wednesday. I woke up to 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, and a voicemail that made me sit up in bed. It was Janet Mosley from Meridian calling my personal cell, which meant she'd gone out of her way to find my contact information outside of company channels. Her message was brief and professional. She wanted to speak with me directly before Thursday's meeting, said she had some questions about the account transition, and asked if I could call her back at my earliest convenience. I checked the time, 6:45 a.m., and called her back immediately, catching her in her car on the way to her office. She thanked me for the quick response and got straight to the point. She said Meridian had been evaluating their relationship with our firm and had concerns about the management oversight they'd seen demonstrated in Monday's meeting. She didn't mention Pritchard by name, but she didn't have to. She asked me how long I'd been managing the day-to-day operations on their account, who I reported to, and whether I had authority to make strategic decisions without multiple layers of approval. I answered honestly, told her I'd been doing the analytical and operational work for over 2 years, that I reported to Pritchard but had limited decision-making authority, and that most strategic direction came from senior management. She was quiet for a moment, then asked if I'd be interested in a different arrangement. The question caught me off guard, and I asked her to clarify. She said Meridian was considering whether to continue with our firm or move to a different consultancy, but before making that decision, they wanted to know if I'd be interested in working with them directly as an independent consultant. She said they valued my work, appreciated my transparency, and believed I had the skills to manage their analytics and strategic planning without the overhead of a large firm. It was a job offer disguised as a hypothetical question, and I felt my pulse quicken even as I kept my voice steady. I told her I'd need to think about it, that I had obligations to my current employer, but that I was honored by her confidence. She said she understood and asked me to consider it carefully before Thursday's meeting. She also mentioned, casually, like it was an afterthought, that if I did decide to work with Meridian independently, they'd want to structure the arrangement properly, with legal protection for both parties and clear ethical boundaries to avoid any accusations of client poaching or breach of contract. It was a signal that she'd thought this through, that she wasn't making an impulsive offer but a strategic one, and that she had resources to make it legitimate. I told her I appreciated the consideration and would think seriously about it. She thanked me again and ended the call, leaving me sitting on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand and my entire future suddenly uncertain. I spent the morning at my desk running scenarios in my head. If I left the firm to work with Meridian directly, I'd lose my salary, my benefits, my trajectory toward senior analyst and eventual manager. But I'd gain autonomy, direct client relationships, and the freedom to build something that was actually mine instead of generating value for people like Pritchard who took credit and offered nothing. The risk was enormous. I had student loans, rent, a car payment, no safety net if the consulting work dried up. But the opportunity was real. Meridian was a stable, growing company with consistent analytics needs, and if I could secure a contract with them, I could build a foundation for independent work. Around 11, I got another call from HR asking me to come down for a compensation discussion at 2 p.m. I agreed and spent the next 3 hours working mechanically, answering emails and updating spreadsheets while my mind stayed locked on the decision ahead. At lunch, I drove to a coffee shop away from the office and called my father in Baltimore. He listened without interrupting while I laid out the situation, the voicemail, the presentation, the investigation, Janet's offer, the firm's sudden interest in promoting me. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and I could picture him sitting in his kitchen with his reading glasses on, thinking it through the way he'd taught me to think through everything. He said 2 things. First, that a promotion from people who'd just tried to destroy me wasn't loyalty, it was damage control, and I shouldn't confuse the two. Second, that my grandmother used to say, the safest chains were the ones you chose yourself, and a good salary at a bad company was still a chain. He didn't tell me what to do, just reminded me that I'd already proven I could build something from evidence and discipline, and that skill didn't disappear whether I worked for a firm or for myself. We talked for 20 more minutes about logistics and money and risk, and by the time I hung up, the decision was clearer. I wasn't going to let Pritchard's firm buy my silence with a title and a raise. I was going to walk away on my terms. At 2, I met with Patricia Monroe and an HR director named Kevin Sims in a small conference room on the executive floor. They had a folder prepared with my personnel file, performance reviews, and what looked like a revised compensation package. Kevin opened by saying the firm valued my contributions and wanted to ensure I felt recognized and supported moving forward. Then Patricia slid the package across the table: a promotion to senior analyst, a 22% salary increase, immediate vesting in the retirement plan, and a performance bonus tied to client retention. It was a substantial offer, the kind that would have meant everything to me 6 months ago, but now it felt hollow, like they were paying me to forget what Pritchard had tried to do. I looked at the numbers, nodded slowly, and asked what was happening with Pritchard. Patricia's expression didn't change, but Kevin glanced down at his folder before answering. He said personnel matters were confidential, but that the firm was making leadership changes on several accounts to improve oversight and accountability. It was corporate speak for, "We're pushing him out," but they weren't going to say it directly. I asked if Pritchard would still have authority over my work or my client relationships, and Patricia said no, that I'd be reporting directly to Dale moving forward with full operational control over the Meridian account. It was the answer I expected, and it confirmed what I needed to know. They were protecting me to protect themselves. I thanked them for the offer and asked if I could have until Friday to consider it. Kevin looked surprised. People in my position usually accepted promotions immediately, but Patricia just nodded and said that was reasonable. She mentioned again that Meridian had specifically requested my involvement in Thursday's meeting, and that the firm hoped I'd be there representing our continued partnership. I said I would be, that I was committed to supporting the client regardless of my employment status, and Patricia's eyes sharpened slightly at that phrasing. She understood I was keeping my options open, and I saw her make a mental note of it. The meeting ended with handshakes and polite smiles, and I walked out knowing I'd just told them I might leave without actually saying the words. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a legal pad and did the math. If I took Meridian's offer and worked as an independent consultant, I'd need to charge enough to replace my salary and benefits while covering my own taxes, insurance, and business expenses. I ran the numbers 3 different ways and kept coming back to the same conclusion. It was viable. Meridian's budget for analytics consulting was substantially higher than what the firm was paying me, which meant there was room for me to charge a competitive rate and still save them money. I drafted a preliminary proposal: a 6-month contract with a monthly retainer, performance benchmarks tied to deliverables, and a professional conduct clause that protected both parties from conflict of interest accusations. It was rough, but it was a starting point. I also drafted a resignation letter, clean and professional, thanking the firm for the opportunity and citing personal career goals that required me to pursue independent consulting. I didn't mention Pritchard, didn't mention the voicemail or the investigation, just kept it neutral and forward-looking. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it right. No burned bridges, no accusations, just a professional transition that left me with a clean reputation and strong references. I saved both documents, encrypted them, and sent copies to my personal email. Then I poured a glass of whiskey, sat on my couch in the dark, and thought about my father's words. The safest chains were the ones you chose yourself. Tomorrow I'd walk into that meeting with Meridian and find out if I had the courage to let them go. Thursday morning, I dressed carefully, suit pressed, shoes polished, like I was going to court instead of a client meeting. The office was tense when I arrived. Word had clearly spread that something significant was happening with Meridian, and people watched me walk to my desk with the kind of attention that made my neck warm. Pritchard's office was dark again, his desk visible through the glass wall, empty except for his computer and a coffee mug someone had left behind. I hadn't seen him since Monday, and the rumor mill said he was on administrative leave pending the audit results, which in corporate terms meant he was already gone. They just hadn't made it official yet. Dale stopped by my desk at 9:30, asked if I was ready for the meeting, and handed me a leather folder with our firm's logo embossed on the front. Inside was a prepared statement about the new oversight protocols we were implementing, a revised budget proposal for Q4, and a letter signed by our CEO apologizing for the management failures and reaffirming our commitment to the partnership. It was damage control packaged as accountability, and Dale told me to present it after I'd addressed Meridian's operational concerns. I took the folder, thanked him, and didn't mention that I'd already decided this would be my last meeting as a firm employee. Let him find out after I'd secured my own future. The meeting started at 11 in the same conference room where everything had unraveled on Monday. Janet Mosley arrived with the same 2 colleagues, plus their general counsel, a tall man named Robert Chen, who looked like he'd come prepared for contract negotiations. That told me everything I needed to know. Meridian wasn't here to be reassured. They were here to restructure the relationship or end it, and they'd brought legal support to make it official. Dale opened with his usual pleasantries, but Janet cut him off politely and said she wanted to hear directly from me about how we planned to address the management issues we'd identified. Dale looked at me, nodded, and I stood up to present. I walked them through the revised oversight structure first, explaining how reporting lines had been changed to ensure direct accountability, and how budget approvals would now require dual authorization above certain thresholds. I showed them the new monitoring systems we were implementing: real-time expense tracking, monthly reconciliation reports, quarterly audits with executive review. It was all standard corporate reform, the kind of thing companies do after scandals to prove they've learned their lesson, and Janet listened carefully but without much reaction. Then I presented the Q4 budget proposal, which was conservative and realistic, showing how we'd deliver the same services at lower cost by eliminating the inefficiencies that had caused the overruns. I could see her doing the math in her head, weighing whether our reforms were credible or just performance. When I finished, Janet thanked me and turned to Dale. She said Meridian appreciated our transparency and the corrective measures we'd outlined, but that they'd been discussing whether our firm was still the right fit for their needs moving forward. The room got very quiet, and Dale's expression shifted from confident to concerned. Janet continued, saying they valued the work I'd done specifically, that my analysis and strategic planning had been exceptional, but they had reservations about continuing with a firm that required this level of oversight reform. It was a diplomatic way of saying they didn't trust us anymore, and Dale started to respond, but Janet held up a hand. She said they had a proposal they wanted to discuss, and she looked directly at me. She asked if I'd given any thought to our conversation from yesterday, and I felt Dale's confusion ripple across the table. He didn't know about the call, didn't know Janet had gone around him to speak with me directly. I said I had thought about it carefully, and that I was interested in exploring an independent consulting arrangement if it could be structured appropriately. Dale's face went blank, processing what I'd just said, and Patricia Monroe, who I hadn't noticed sitting at the far end of the table, leaned forward with sudden attention. Janet nodded, like she'd expected this answer, and Robert Chen opened his briefcase and pulled out a contract. He slid it across the table to me, not to Dale, and said Meridian was prepared to offer me a 6-month consulting contract with option to extend, covering the same scope of work I'd been doing but with direct reporting to their executive team. The terms were outlined in the document: a monthly retainer that worked out to 40% more than my current salary, performance bonuses tied to deliverables, professional liability insurance provided by Meridian, and a clean separation clause that protected me from any claims of client theft or breach of contract. It was a real offer, professionally drafted, better than anything I could have negotiated on my own, and it was sitting in front of me while my current employer watched. Dale found his voice and said we should discuss this privately, that there were competitive and ethical considerations that needed to be addressed before any decisions were made. Janet responded calmly that she understood his concern, but that Meridian had done their due diligence and believed this arrangement was in everyone's best interest. It would save them money, give them direct access to the expertise they'd been relying on, and allow my current firm to exit the relationship gracefully without the reputational damage of being fired by a major client. It was a checkmate move, giving Dale the choice between losing Meridian entirely or losing just me, and we both knew which option his CEO would prefer. Patricia asked for a brief recess, and Dale stood up immediately, gesturing for me to follow him outside. In the hallway, Dale kept his voice low, but his anger was visible. He asked what the hell I thought I was doing, whether I'd been negotiating with Meridian behind the firm's back, if I understood the legal implications of poaching a client. I stayed calm, told him Janet had reached out to me, not the other way around, and that I hadn't solicited anything or breached any agreement. I reminded him that I was an at-will employee with no non-compete clause in my contract, that Meridian was free to hire whoever they wanted, and that I was free to accept legitimate job offers. He stared at me, and I saw him realize that I'd been 3 steps ahead this entire time, that I hadn't just survived Pritchard's attack, I'd turned it into leverage and an exit strategy. His expression shifted from anger to calculation, and he asked what it would take to keep me. I told him nothing. I told him I was done working for people who'd let Pritchard try to destroy me and only cared about stopping him when the client noticed. Then I walked back into the conference room and told Janet I'd accept her offer. The rest of Thursday disappeared into logistics and paperwork. Robert Chen walked me through the consulting contract line by line, explaining the liability protections, the payment schedule, the performance metrics that would trigger bonuses, and the termination clauses that protected both parties. It was a solid agreement, professionally structured to withstand scrutiny from both my former firm and any regulatory review. I signed it in the conference room with Janet and her team as witnesses, and she shook my hand with genuine warmth, told me she'd been hoping I'd have the courage to accept. Dale sat through the entire process with his jaw clenched, watching his leverage evaporate, and Patricia took notes that I knew would end up in some kind of legal assessment about whether the firm had grounds to challenge my departure. When the meeting ended, Dale pulled me aside one more time and said I'd be hearing from our legal team about the separation terms, that the firm needed to ensure I wasn't taking proprietary information or violating any confidentiality agreements. I told him everything I'd worked on for Meridian had been done on their behalf and with their data, that I had no intention of using firm resources or methodologies, and that I'd be happy to cooperate with any reasonable exit process. He nodded stiffly and walked away, and I knew he was already on the phone with the CEO explaining how they'd just lost a major client and a productive employee in the same afternoon. I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. I went back to my desk and started the formal separation process, beginning with an email to HR confirming my resignation effective immediately. I attached the consulting contract as documentation that I had legitimate alternative employment and wasn't leaving to compete directly with the firm. Then I started archiving my personal files, removing bookmarks and passwords, clearing my browser history, making sure I left nothing behind that could be construed as taking company property. The process took 2 hours, and by the time I finished, Kevin Sims from HR was standing at my desk with a banker's box and a security escort. They'd moved fast, which told me Dale had decided to treat this as a potential threat, rather than a normal resignation. Kevin was professional but cold, explaining that I'd need to return my laptop, my access badge, my company phone, and any files or materials related to firm business. I handed everything over without argument, asked about my final paycheck and accumulated vacation time, and Kevin said it would be processed within 2 weeks per company policy. The security escort, a tired-looking man in his 50s who seemed embarrassed by the whole situation, walked me to the elevator and rode down with me to the lobby. As we exited the building into the afternoon heat, he told me quietly that he'd seen a lot of people walked out over the years, and I was handling it with more dignity than most. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked to my car carrying the banker's box with my few personal items, a photo of my parents, a coffee mug from Howard University, and a notebook full of project ideas I'd never had time to pursue. I sat in my car for a few minutes, windows down, letting the reality settle over me. I'd just quit a stable job with benefits and a clear career path to become an independent consultant with one client and no safety net. It was reckless by any conventional measure, the kind of decision my college advisor would have called self-sabotage. But I'd been backed into a corner by Pritchard's betrayal, and instead of accepting the trap, I'd found a way to turn it into an opportunity. The voicemail on Derek's phone had been the catalyst, but the real power had come from 3 years of documentation, discipline, and refusing to be invisible. I'd built credibility without knowing I'd need it, and when the moment came, that credibility had been worth more than any promotion Dale could offer. I drove home slowly, taking surface streets instead of the highway, giving myself time to process the shift. My phone buzzed constantly. Texts from coworkers asking if the rumor was true, if I'd really quit, if I was okay. I ignored most of them, responded to a few with brief confirmations that I was fine and pursuing a new opportunity. Marcus sent a message that just said, "We need to talk," and I deleted it without responding. Whatever role he'd played in Pritchard's plan didn't matter anymore. He was still there, still trapped in that system, and I was out. The thought brought a grim satisfaction that I let myself feel without shame. At home, I opened my laptop and started building the infrastructure I'd need to operate as an independent consultant. I registered a business entity online, set up a separate bank account for contract payments, created a basic website with my credentials and service offerings. It was bare bones, but it was mine, and every click felt like building something that couldn't be taken away by someone else's politics or ego. I drafted an email to Janet confirming my start date, Monday, 4 days away, and outlining my initial priorities for the Meridian account. She responded within an hour, welcoming me to the team and copying her executive assistant on logistics for office access and equipment setup. It was real. I was actually doing this. That evening, I called my father again and told him what had happened. He listened to the whole story, the meeting, the contract, the escort out of the building, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying he was proud of me. Not because I'd quit, but because I'd refused to let them buy my silence or my future. He said most people would have taken the promotion and convinced themselves it was a win, would have stayed in a place that had proven it didn't value them until they were too tired or too comfortable to leave. He said I'd done the hard thing, the thing that required faith in myself more than faith in a system, and that was worth more than any salary. We talked for an hour about next steps and contingency plans, and by the time we hung up, I felt steady again, grounded in the decision I'd made. I spent the rest of the night preparing for Monday, reviewing Meridian's current projects and planning the transition of work from the firm's systems to my own processes. The work was familiar, the same analysis and strategic planning I'd been doing for years, but the context was completely different. I wasn't generating value for people who'd exploited anymore. I was building something for myself, with a client who'd chosen me specifically because they valued my work enough to structure a contract around it. As I worked, I thought about Pritchard, wondered if he knew yet what had happened, if Dale had told him that his attempt to destroy me had ended with me walking away with his biggest client. I hoped he did. I hoped it kept him up at night. Friday morning, I woke up unemployed for the first time in 3 years, and the feeling was strange. Part relief, part anxiety, mostly adrenaline. I didn't have to go to the office, didn't have to check email or prepare for meetings, but I couldn't sleep in either. My mind was already running through everything I needed to accomplish before Monday. Finalize the business registration, set up accounting software, draft templates for invoicing and project documentation, buy professional liability insurance. I made coffee and started working through the list, methodical and focused, treating my apartment like a temporary office until I figured out the longer-term logistics. Around 10, my personal phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but that showed up as coming from Atlanta. I answered carefully, and a woman's voice asked if I was Ezra Cole. When I confirmed, she introduced herself as Sharon Wright from our firm's legal department and said she needed to discuss the terms of my separation. I told her I'd already coordinated with HR and returned all company property, but she said there were additional matters that required clarification. She asked if I'd be willing to come to the office for a meeting that afternoon, and something in her tone told me this wasn't optional. I agreed to 2 p.m. and hung up wondering what leverage they thought they still had. I arrived at the building at 1:55, signed in as a visitor, and was escorted to a conference room on the legal floor that I'd never seen before. Sharon was there with Patricia Monroe and another attorney I didn't recognize, a younger man with the kind of expensive suit that signaled corporate litigation. They offered me water, which I declined, and Sharon opened a folder that contained what looked like my employment contract and several other documents I couldn't identify from across the table. She began by saying the firm appreciated my contributions and wanted to ensure we had a clear understanding about post-employment obligations, particularly regarding client relationships and confidential information. I told them I'd been careful not to take any proprietary materials, that everything I'd worked on for Meridian belonged to Meridian, and that I had no intention of soliciting other firm clients or using firm methodologies. Sharon nodded, but said they had concerns about the timing and nature of my consulting arrangement, specifically whether I'd engaged in activities that could be considered a conflict of interest while still employed. It was an accusation dressed up as a clarification, and I felt my jaw tighten even as I kept my expression neutral. I asked her to be specific about what activities she was referring to, and Patricia answered instead, saying they'd reviewed the timeline and noted that Janet Mosley had called my personal cell on Wednesday morning, before I'd submitted my resignation. I explained that Janet had initiated the contact, that I hadn't solicited the conversation or the job offer, and that I'd been transparent about the opportunity when it was presented in Thursday's meeting. The younger attorney, his nameplate said Gregory Marsh, asked if I'd recorded that phone call or taken notes about the discussion. I said no, that it had been a brief professional conversation, and I hadn't felt the need to document it. He made a note on his legal pad, and I realized they were looking for something to hang on me, some technical violation they could use to challenge the Meridian contract or extract concessions. Sharon asked if I'd be willing to sign an additional non-solicitation agreement covering the firm's current client list for a period of 12 months, and I understood immediately what they were doing. They wanted me to waive rights I didn't have to give up in exchange for a clean exit. I looked at Patricia and asked directly if the firm believed I'd breached my employment contract or engaged in unethical conduct. She hesitated, glanced at Sharon, and said they were concerned about appearances and wanted to protect the firm's relationships. I told her I appreciated that concern, but that I wasn't going to sign away my ability to work in my own industry because they were worried about optics. I reminded them that I had no non-compete clause, that Meridian had approached me with a legitimate offer after witnessing management failures that the firm had now acknowledged through its internal investigation, and that my acceptance of that offer was entirely legal. Gregory started to respond, but I kept talking, my voice level but firm. I said if they wanted to pursue legal action, I'd be happy to cooperate with discovery, which would likely require deposing Pritchard about his management practices and the circumstances that led to Meridian's loss of confidence in the firm. The room went quiet, and I saw them all calculate the same equation. Fighting me meant exposing Pritchard's failures publicly, which meant more reputational damage and potential liability. Sharon closed her folder and said they weren't suggesting legal action, just trying to ensure everyone understood their obligations. I told her I understood mine perfectly, and that if they had specific concerns about my conduct, they should put them in writing so I could respond appropriately. Patricia stood up, which signaled the meeting was over, and thanked me for coming in. As I walked out, Gregory held the door and said quietly that he'd heard what happened with the Meridian presentation, that I'd handled it well, and that he hoped things worked out for me. It was the closest thing to an admission that they knew I'd been wronged, and I nodded my thanks without elaborating. I left the building for the second time in 2 days, and this time I knew I wouldn't be coming back. They'd tried one last time to control the narrative, to make me sign something that protected them more than it protected me, and I'd refused without blinking. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I wasn't the junior analyst hoping for approval anymore. I was the consultant who'd walked away with their client, and they couldn't touch me without damaging themselves further. I drove home feeling lighter, like I'd shed something heavy that I'd been carrying without realizing it. The fear of retaliation, the need for their validation, the belief that I needed them more than they needed me. All of it was gone, burned away by Pritchard's voicemail and my own willingness to bet on myself. That evening, I finished setting up my business infrastructure and drafted my first invoice to Meridian for professional services, scheduled to be sent after my first month of work. I created a simple budget, tracking my expenses and income, calculated how many months I could survive if the contract fell through, and built contingency plans for finding additional clients if I needed them. It was sobering to see how quickly my savings could disappear, but it was also clarifying. I'd made the jump, and now I had to make it work through competence and discipline, the same skills that had gotten me here. I thought about my father's career as an electrician, how he'd built a reputation one job at a time until people requested him specifically, and I realized I was following the same path in a different industry. Build trust, deliver results, let the work speak for itself. Before bed, I checked my email one last time and found a message from Derek, my barber. He'd heard through the neighborhood network that I'd quit my job and wanted to make sure I was okay. I wrote back telling him I was more than okay, that the voicemail he'd played for me had changed everything, and that I owed him more than a tip could ever cover. He responded immediately. "That's what we do, bro. We look out for each other. Proud of you." I read it twice, felt something warm and solid in my chest, and realized that the real victory wasn't just escaping Pritchard or landing the Meridian contract. It was finding out who had my back when everything fell apart, and refusing to let anyone make me forget my own worth. I saved Derek's message, closed my laptop, and went to bed ready for Monday. Monday morning, I drove to Meridian's headquarters in Buckhead, a modern office building with floor-to-ceiling windows and a lobby that smelled like expensive coffee. Janet's assistant met me at reception, handed me a temporary access badge, and walked me up to the executive floor where they'd set up a workspace for me. A decent-sized office with a window view, a new desk, and equipment that was better than what I'd had at the firm. Janet stopped by within 20 minutes, welcomed me officially, and said she was glad I'd taken the leap. She introduced me to her leadership team in a brief conference room meeting, explained that I'd be supporting their strategic planning and operational analytics, and made it clear I had direct access to her and authority to request data or resources as needed. It was a statement of confidence that established my credibility immediately. The first week was intensive, getting up to speed on Meridian's internal systems and understanding their priorities beyond what I'd seen as an external consultant. I met with department heads, reviewed their growth projections for the next 2 years, and identified inefficiencies in their supply chain logistics that were costing them money. The work was familiar but more engaging because I was talking directly to decision-makers instead of filtering everything through Pritchard's ego. By Friday, I delivered my first analysis, a routing optimization model that would save them approximately $40,000 per quarter, and Janet approved implementation immediately. It felt good to see my work translate into action within days instead of weeks. During my second week, I got a LinkedIn message from someone I didn't know, a consultant named Troy Bennett, who said he'd heard about my transition from mutual contacts in the industry. He asked if I'd be interested in grabbing coffee to discuss potential collaboration opportunities, and I agreed, curious about how word had spread so quickly. We met at a place near Meridian's office, and Troy turned out to be mid-30s, sharp, running his own consultancy focused on operational efficiency for logistics companies. He told me straight out that he'd heard I'd left my firm after exposing management fraud and that Meridian had hired me directly, which had made waves in the Atlanta consulting scene. People were talking about it as a case study in how to handle corporate betrayal with professionalism and leverage. Troy said he had more work than he could handle and was looking for people he could trust to collaborate with on larger projects. He offered to refer overflow clients to me if I was interested in expanding beyond Meridian, said my reputation for thorough documentation and clean ethics was exactly what he looked for in professional partners. It was a genuine offer, and I realized my exit from the firm hadn't damaged my career. It had enhanced it. People respected the fact that I'd walked away from a bad situation instead of compromising, and that respect was translating into opportunities. I told Troy I was interested, and we exchanged contact information, agreeing to stay in touch as projects developed. By the time I left that coffee meeting, I had a potential pipeline of work that could sustain me beyond the Meridian contract. The third week brought unexpected news. I was working late at Meridian when my personal phone buzzed with a call from a number I recognized, the firm's main line. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. It was Kevin Sims from HR, and his voice was carefully neutral when he asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I said I did, and he told me the firm's investigation into the Meridian account had concluded with Pritchard's termination for cause, effective immediately. They'd found multiple instances of unauthorized expenses, falsified approval documentation, and attempts to misrepresent budget performance to clients. Kevin said they were informing me as a courtesy since I'd been directly involved in the account, and because they wanted me to know the firm had taken appropriate action. I thanked him for the information and asked if Pritchard had been given severance. Kevin paused, then said, no. That termination for cause meant no severance package and immediate forfeiture of unvested benefits. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Pritchard's conduct had been reported to the Industry Regulatory Board as required by their professional standards policy, which meant his reputation was now formally damaged in a way that would follow him to any future employer. It was the professional equivalent of being blacklisted, and I felt a cold satisfaction knowing that Pritchard's attempt to destroy me had ended with him destroying himself. Kevin asked if I had any questions, and I told him I didn't, that I appreciated the follow-up. He wished me well with my consulting work and hung up. I sat in my office at Meridian after that call, looking out at the city lights, and thought about the trajectory of the last 3 weeks. Pritchard had recorded that voicemail planning my termination, convinced he held all the power, and now he was unemployed with a damaged reputation while I was building an independent practice with strong client relationships and growing opportunities. The reversal was complete, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like justice, the slow, grinding kind that comes from documentation and patience rather than confrontation. I hadn't had to yell or threaten or burn bridges. I'd just shown people the facts and let them draw their own conclusions, and the facts had been devastating. That evening, I drove back to my apartment and found myself thinking about Marcus Hale, the operations manager who'd stopped by my desk that Monday morning before the presentation, who'd seemed nervous and too interested in what I was working on. I still didn't know for certain if he'd been the person Pritchard was talking to in that voicemail, but the timing and his behavior suggested he'd known something. I checked his LinkedIn profile out of curiosity and saw he was still at the firm, still in the same position, no indication that he'd been implicated in anything. If he had been involved, he'd probably cooperated with the investigation to save himself, threw Pritchard under the bus and walked away clean. It bothered me that he might have escaped consequences, but I also recognized that my fight had never been with him. It had been with Pritchard, and that fight was over. I made dinner, something simple, and ate it while reviewing my calendar for the next month. Meridian had 3 major projects lined up that needed my analysis. Troy had referred a potential client for a consulting assessment, and I'd been invited to speak on a panel about independent consulting at a local business conference. My schedule was full, my income was stable, and I was building something that belonged to me. 3 weeks ago, I'd been sitting in Derek's barber chair listening to my manager plan my destruction. Now, I was sitting in my own apartment, running my own business, working with clients who valued my expertise. The distance between those 2 moments felt enormous, but the path had been straight. Document everything, stay professional, refuse to be erased. It had worked. And now I got to live with the results. By the end of my first month at Meridian, I'd established a rhythm that felt sustainable and productive. I worked from their office 3 days a week, from home the other 2, and had clear boundaries around evenings and weekends that I'd never managed at the firm. Janet checked in regularly, always with specific questions about projects rather than vague requests for status updates, and her executive team treated me like a valued partner rather than a subordinate. The cultural difference was striking. At the firm, I'd spent half my energy managing Pritchard's ego and protecting myself from his incompetence. At Meridian, I spent all my energy actually solving problems. My work product improved immediately, and so did my stress levels. The consulting work Troy referred came through in early October, a mid-sized distribution company that needed help optimizing their warehouse operations and inventory forecasting. I met with their CEO, presented a proposal for a 3-month engagement, and negotiated terms that were fair for both parties. They signed the contract, and suddenly I had 2 clients generating income, which meant I could start building a real buffer in my business account. The work was demanding, but manageable, and I found myself energized rather than exhausted at the end of each week. I was learning the business side of consulting, proposal writing, client management, scope negotiation, and discovering I was good at it when I didn't have someone like Pritchard undermining me. One evening in mid-October, I was back at Derek's barbershop for a trim, and he asked how everything had turned out with the job situation. I gave him the full story: the presentation, the investigation, Pritchard's termination, the consulting contracts, the growing client base. Derek listened while he worked, nodding occasionally, and when I finished he just said, "See, that's what I'm talking about. You handled that like a man. Didn't lose your cool, didn't make it personal, just did the work and let the truth handle the rest." Another customer waiting his turn added that he'd heard about someone in corporate who'd walked out with a client after exposing a crooked manager, asked if that was me. When I confirmed it, he gave me a fist bump and said the neighborhood was proud to see someone win like that. The recognition felt good, but what felt better was the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd rebuilt my professional life on my own terms. I wasn't rich, wasn't famous, hadn't made some dramatic public statement about corporate corruption. I just refused to accept being disposable, and that refusal had opened doors I hadn't known existed. Derek finished my fade, and I paid him with a tip that made him raise his eyebrows. I told him that voicemail had been worth every dollar, and he laughed, said he was just glad he'd thought to tell me before Pritchard deleted it. As I left the shop, I realized I owed that moment everything. Without hearing Pritchard's voice laying out his plan, I would have walked into that termination meeting unprepared and vulnerable. Another black professional erased by a white manager's ambition. In November, I got a call from Dale Fenton, my former VP. I almost didn't answer, but professional curiosity got the better of me. His voice was strained when he greeted me, more formal than I remembered, and he asked if I'd be willing to meet him for lunch to discuss something confidential. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to know what the firm could possibly want from me now. We met at a steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where corporate people made deals over expensive cuts and bourbon. Dale looked older than I remembered, tired around the eyes, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me the firm had lost 3 more clients since Meridian left, that word had spread about the management failures and the investigation, and that their reputation in the Atlanta market was suffering. He said they were rebuilding their analytics division and wanted to know if I'd consider coming back in a leadership role, senior manager position, significant salary increase, equity stake in the division, direct report to him with no intermediaries. It was a serious offer, the kind that would have represented everything I'd worked toward 3 months ago, and Dale presented it with genuine conviction. He admitted the firm had failed me, said Pritchard's behavior had been inexcusable, and claimed they'd learned from the experience and wanted to make it right. I listened without interrupting, let him finish his pitch, and then I asked him a single question. Where was this offer when Pritchard was planning to fire me? Dale didn't have an answer for that, just looked down at his drink and said he understood if I couldn't trust them anymore. I told him I appreciated the offer, but that I wasn't interested in returning. I explained that I'd built something independent that gave me control over my work and my relationships, that I was earning more as a consultant than I would have as a senior manager, and that I'd learned I didn't need the firm's infrastructure or validation to succeed. Dale nodded slowly, said he'd expected that answer but had to try, and then asked if I'd be willing to refer clients to the firm if opportunities arose. I told him I'd consider it on a case-by-case basis, that I held no personal grudge against the organization, but that any referrals would depend on whether I believed the firm could actually serve the client's needs. We finished lunch quickly after that, shook hands in the parking lot, and I drove away knowing I'd never have that conversation again. The firm represented my past, and I was done looking backward. December brought the end of my initial 6-month contract with Meridian, and Janet called me into her office to discuss renewal terms. I'd prepared a presentation showing the value I'd delivered, cost savings of over $300,000 through operational improvements, successful implementation of 3 major strategic initiatives, and consistently high satisfaction ratings from her executive team. Janet reviewed it carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, and then slid a new contract across her desk. It was a 12-month extension, with a 25% increase in my monthly retainer, expanded scope to include strategic planning for their international expansion, and a performance bonus structure that could add another 30% to my annual income. She said I'd exceeded expectations and that Meridian wanted to deepen the partnership, wanted me to be part of their growth story for the long term. I signed the contract that afternoon, and as I walked back to my office, I thought about the compound effect of good decisions. Staying calm in Derek's barbershop instead of panicking. Documenting 3 years of approvals instead of trusting the system. Presenting facts instead of accusations in that Monday meeting. Accepting Janet's offer instead of staying at the firm for a comfortable promotion. Each choice had been a small bet on myself, and together they'd built something larger than I'd imagined possible. I was making more money than I'd ever made, working with clients who respected me, building a reputation that generated referrals and opportunities. And I'd done it all by refusing to let Pritchard's voicemail define my future. That evening, I drove to Baltimore to spend a few days with my parents for the holidays. My father met me at the door, hugged me hard, and said he'd been following my progress through our calls. Over dinner, he asked me what I'd learned from everything that had happened, and I thought about it carefully before answering. I told him I'd learned that documentation was power, that staying professional when others lost control was a competitive advantage, and that the people who tried to erase you often ended up erasing themselves. But more than that, I'd learned that I was capable of more than I'd believed, that the security of a corporate job was sometimes just the illusion of safety, and that betting on myself, really betting with real risk, was the only way to find out what I could build. My father listened, nodded, and told me about a job he'd done years ago where a contractor had tried to stiff him on payment, claimed the work was substandard, and threatened to blackball him with the union. My father had kept every receipt, every inspection report, every communication, and when the contractor refused to pay, he'd filed a claim with the labor board and won full payment plus penalties. The contractor's company folded within a year after other workers came forward with similar complaints. My father said the lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about knowing your worth and having proof when someone tried to deny it. I realized then that everything I'd done had been following the blueprint he'd given me years ago, applied to a different industry, but built on the same principles. Do excellent work, document everything, and never let anyone make you small. Christmas morning. I woke up in my childhood bedroom and checked my email out of habit. There was a message from Troy Bennett with a subject line that said, Opportunity. He'd been approached by a national logistics firm looking for consultants to help with a major operational transformation. Multiple locations, budget in 7 figures, timeline of 18 months. They needed a team, and Troy wanted to know if I'd be interested in partnering on the proposal. It was the kind of project that could establish me as a serious player in the industry, the kind of opportunity that came from having a reputation for competence and integrity. I wrote back immediately saying I was interested, and we set up a call for the following week to discuss strategy and team structure. I spent the rest of the holiday thinking about the trajectory ahead. More clients, bigger projects, possibly hiring other consultants to work with me, building something that could scale beyond just my individual capacity. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious, but I'd learned that ambitious wasn't the same as impossible. 6 months ago, I'd been a junior analyst living in fear of my manager's politics, and now I was planning to pitch a 7-figure consulting contract. The distance between those two versions of myself had been crossed one documented email at a time, one professional decision at a time, one refusal to accept less than I deserved at a time. And I was just getting started. January came cold and clear, and I started the new year by officially registering my consulting practice as an LLC with a proper business name, Cole Strategic Analytics. It felt significant to put my name on it, to claim ownership explicitly instead of hiding behind generic corporate language. I hired an accountant to handle the increasingly complex tax situation, upgraded my website to something more professional, and invested in business insurance that covered multiple clients and larger project scopes. These were the infrastructure decisions that signaled I was building something permanent, not just freelancing until something better came along. The proposal for the national logistics firm consumed most of January. Troy and I worked together to design a comprehensive transformation plan that covered supply chain optimization, technology integration, workforce training, and performance measurement. My portion focused on data analytics and operational modeling, showing how we could identify inefficiencies and quantify improvements. We presented to their executive team in late January, a 3-hour session where we fielded tough questions and demonstrated our expertise through case studies and detailed methodology. The CEO was a woman named Diane Foster, sharp and demanding, who'd built the company from 2 trucks to a national network. She asked me specifically about my background, and I told her the truth. I'd left a corporate consulting firm to work independently after management failures had compromised my effectiveness. She nodded, like she understood exactly what I meant, and asked if I could handle pressure and tight deadlines. I told her I could. The discipline and documentation were my foundation. 2 days later, Troy called to say we'd won the contract. The news changed everything. The project was worth enough that I'd need to bring on 2 junior consultants to help with data collection and analysis, which meant I was suddenly responsible for other people's livelihoods and professional development. I spent February recruiting, reaching out to former colleagues, interviewing candidates, checking references carefully. I hired a recent graduate from Georgia Tech named Jasmine Chen, who had exceptional quantitative skills, and a mid-career analyst named Terrence Williams who'd been laid off from a competitor and needed a second chance. Both were hungry, talented, and grateful for the opportunity, and I made sure to set clear expectations about work quality, communication, and professional conduct. I wasn't going to be Pritchard, wasn't going to take credit or create fear, but I also wasn't going to accept mediocrity. Training them took time I hadn't budgeted for, but it was worth it to see them grow into the work. Jasmine absorbed methodology like a sponge and started producing analysis that rivaled what I'd done at her experience level. Terrence brought maturity and client management skills that helped smooth relationships with the logistics firm's middle management. By March, we were functioning as a team, dividing responsibilities based on strengths and delivering work that exceeded the client's expectations. Diane Foster sent me an email after our first major deliverable saying she was impressed with our professionalism and precision, that she'd made the right choice in hiring us. That validation felt different than anything I'd experienced at the firm. It was earned through my own standards, not filtered through someone else's agenda. In April, I got an unexpected message on LinkedIn from Marcus Hale, the operations manager from my old firm who I'd suspected was involved in Pritchard's plan. His message was brief and awkward, saying he'd heard about my success and wanted to congratulate me on building a thriving practice. He mentioned he was looking for new opportunities and wondered if I'd be open to discussing potential collaboration. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the old anger surface and then subside. Marcus had been complicit in something that could have destroyed me, had stayed silent when he should have spoken up, and now he wanted to benefit from the success I'd built in spite of him. I could have ignored the message or sent back something cutting, but instead I wrote a single sentence. I appreciate the note, but I don't think we're a good fit professionally. Best of luck with your search. Then I deleted his contact and moved on. May brought the 6-month milestone on the logistics transformation project, and Troy and I presented our interim results to Diane's board of directors. We'd identified over $2 million in annual savings through route optimization and warehouse consolidation, implemented new analytics dashboards that gave them real-time visibility into operations, and trained their management team on data-driven decision-making. The board approved continuation of the project and added a third phase focused on technology modernization that extended our contract by another year. Walking out of that board meeting, Troy pulled me aside and said I'd handled myself like someone who'd been doing this for decades, that clients trusted me because I delivered facts without spin. He asked if I'd be interested in formalizing our partnership, creating a joint venture that could pursue even larger projects. I told him I'd think about it, that I valued independence but recognized the power of strategic alliance. By June, Cole's strategic analytics had grown beyond what I'd imagined a year ago. I had 3 major clients generating consistent revenue, 2 employees who were developing into strong consultants, a pipeline of potential projects worth over $3 million, and a reputation in the Atlanta market as someone who did thorough, honest, high-quality work. My income had tripled compared to my firm's salary, my savings account had a buffer that gave me genuine security, and I was getting inquiries from companies asking if I'd consider speaking at conferences or contributing articles to industry publications. I wasn't famous, but I was known among people who mattered in my field, and that reputation was built entirely on competence and character. One evening that month, I was working late at my home office when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I answered cautiously, and a man's voice I didn't recognize asked if I was Ezra Cole. When I confirmed, he introduced himself as Richard Morrison, a partner at a venture capital firm. He said he'd been following my work through industry contacts and wanted to know if I'd ever considered scaling my consulting practice into a larger advisory firm. He explained that they were looking to invest in professional services companies with strong leadership and differentiated capabilities, and my track record of building client relationships and delivering measurable results fit their criteria. It was a conversation about private equity investment, about turning my practice into something institutional, and it was so far beyond what I'd considered possible that I had to ask him to repeat the premise. Richard was patient, explaining how the investment would work: capital to hire more talent, infrastructure to support multiple offices, brand development to compete for national contracts, with me retaining majority ownership and operational control. He said they'd invested in similar firms before and had a track record of helping founders scale without losing their culture or values. I told him I'd need time to consider it, that I'd built this practice specifically to maintain independence and control, and that I wasn't sure I wanted to introduce outside capital or governance. He said he understood and asked if I'd at least meet with him to discuss the possibilities, no obligation, just a conversation about what growth could look like. I agreed to meet, hung up, and sat in my office feeling the weight of decisions I'd never expected to face. I thought about Pritchard, about that voicemail Derek had played for me in the barber shop, about how close I'd come to being erased instead of elevated. Everything that was happening now, the clients, the team, the investment opportunity, existed because I'd refused to accept Pritchard's version of my future. I'd documented my worth, exposed his failures, and walked away when staying would have meant compromising. And those choices, made under pressure in moments when I could have chosen safety over courage, had compounded into something larger than survival. They'd built a foundation for real success, the kind that came from owning my work and my reputation. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do about Richard's offer, but I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever I decided, it would be my choice, made on my terms, with no one else's approval required. July brought a series of events that felt like the universe closing the circle on everything that had started in Derek's barbershop. I was at a networking event downtown, one of those industry mixers where consultants and executives traded business cards and made shallow conversation, when I saw someone across the room who made me stop mid-sentence. It was Gerald Pritchard, looking diminished in a suit that didn't fit as well as I remembered, holding a drink and standing alone while everyone else moved in clusters. He hadn't seen me yet, and I watched him for a moment, noting the stiffness in his posture, the way he checked his phone compulsively, the absence of anyone approaching him to talk. He looked isolated in a room full of people, and I understood immediately what had happened. His termination had followed him. His reputation had been damaged beyond repair, and he was here trying to rebuild something that might already be too broken to save. I could have left, could have walked out the side exit and avoided the confrontation entirely, but something made me stay. Not anger, not a desire for revenge, just a cold curiosity about what he'd say if we spoke. I walked over slowly, and when I stopped beside him, he turned and recognized me. His face went through several expressions: surprise, discomfort, something that might have been shame, before settling into a forced smile. He said my name like a question, asked how I'd been, and I told him honestly that I'd been doing well, that I was running my own consulting practice now. He nodded, tried to say something congratulatory, but the words came out hollow. I asked him what he was working on, and he hesitated before admitting he was between opportunities, that the market was challenging, that he was exploring options. I let the silence sit for a moment, let him feel the full weight of where we both stood. Then I told him I'd heard about his termination, that I knew about the investigation and the findings, and that I wanted him to understand something clearly. What happened to him wasn't revenge, it was consequence. I said he'd spent years taking credit for other people's work, making decisions he blamed on subordinates when they went wrong, and building a career on exploitation instead of competence. I told him that voicemail he'd left, the one where he planned my termination, had been the catalyst. But the real problem was that he'd never respected the people who worked for him enough to think they'd document his failures. His face flushed red, and he started to say something defensive, but I cut him off. I said I hoped he learned something from this, that I genuinely hoped he became better, but that I had no interest in helping him or staying in touch. Then I walked away, leaving him standing there with his drink and his excuses. Outside the venue, I took a deep breath and felt the last piece of anger drain away. Seeing Pritchard diminished hadn't brought satisfaction the way I'd thought it might. It had just brought closure, the confirmation that the system had worked the way it was supposed to when documentation met accountability. He'd tried to destroy me and had destroyed himself instead, and now we were both living with the results of our choices. Mine had led to growth and opportunity. His had led to isolation and professional exile. The symmetry was stark, but it wasn't personal anymore. It was just outcome. In August, I met with Richard Morrison and his partners to discuss their investment proposal in detail. They showed me financial models, growth projections, case studies from other firms they'd helped scale. The opportunity was real. They'd invest $2 million in exchange for 35% equity, giving me capital to hire a full team, open offices in 3 cities, and pursue Fortune 500 contracts I couldn't compete for alone. But it also meant board meetings, quarterly reviews, growth targets, and accountability to investors who'd want returns on their capital. I told them I needed time to decide, that I'd built this practice specifically to avoid the kind of corporate politics that had nearly destroyed me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to introduce new layers of oversight even with good intentions. Richard leaned back and said something that stayed with me. The question isn't whether you want to be big, Ezra. The question is whether you want to be relevant in 5 years. He explained that the consulting industry was consolidating, that independent practitioners were getting squeezed out by firms with national reach and institutional relationships, and that staying small might feel safe, but could become a trap. He said I had a 2-year window to scale before the market shifted, and that his firm could accelerate that timeline significantly. It was a calculated pitch designed to create urgency, but it was also probably true. I'd seen enough of the industry to know that access and scale mattered, that clients chose firms with brand recognition and capacity even when smaller consultants did better work. I spent the rest of August consulting with my father, with Troy, with my accountant, and with a business attorney I'd hired to review the terms. Everyone gave me different advice based on their own perspectives and experiences, and I realized the decision ultimately came down to what I valued most: control or growth, independence or impact, building something small that was entirely mine, or building something larger that could outlast me. There was no wrong answer, just different versions of success with different costs. By the end of the month, I'd made my choice, and I called Richard to schedule a meeting. September 5th, I signed the investment agreement in Richard's conference room, surrounded by attorneys and partners who welcomed me as their newest portfolio company. The terms were fair. I retained 51% ownership and full operational control. They got their equity stake and board representation, and we agreed on growth targets that were ambitious but achievable. The capital hit my business account the following week, and I immediately began executing the expansion plan, hiring senior consultants in Atlanta, opening satellite offices in Charlotte and Nashville, investing in marketing and brand development, and pursuing contracts with national clients who'd never considered working with a small independent firm. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but I'd learned that growth required risk, and I'd gotten comfortable with risk over the past year. By late September, Cole Strategic Analytics had 12 employees, office space in 3 cities, and active projects with 7 major clients generating over $5 million in annual revenue. I'd promoted Jasmine and Terrence to senior consultant roles, brought on experienced professionals to lead each office, and established systems for quality control and client management that reflected my values: thorough documentation, transparent communication, and respect for everyone's contributions. The firm looked nothing like the place I'd left a year ago. It was faster, leaner, more focused on results than politics, and built around the principle that good work should be recognized and rewarded without games or exploitation. One evening in October, I drove to Derek's barbershop for my regular appointment, and when I walked in, he smiled and said he'd heard I was doing big things, that people in the neighborhood were talking about how I'd built a whole company. I sat in the chair and told him the full story: the investment, the expansion, the team, the revenue, and he listened while he worked, nodding occasionally. When he finished the cut and I stood to pay, Derek waved off the money and said this one was on him, that seeing me win like this was payment enough. I insisted, left twice my usual amount on the counter, and told him that none of it would have happened without the voicemail he'd played for me that Saturday morning. Derek just shook his head and said, "Nah, man, I just pressed play. You did everything else." We shook hands, and I walked out into the October evening feeling like I'd finally reached solid ground after a year of climbing. The final piece fell into place in late October when Diane Foster called me directly instead of going through her assistant. Her logistics company had been acquired by a national conglomerate, and the new ownership wanted to replicate our transformation work across their entire network, 53 locations in 31 states, budget of $42 million over 3 years. It was the kind of contract that established firms, changed trajectories, turned consultants into industry leaders. Diane said she'd recommended my firm specifically, told the new executives that I'd delivered exceptional results and could be trusted to execute at scale. She also mentioned, carefully, that she'd heard about my history at my former firm, about what had happened with my manager and how I'd handled it. She said that story, the documentation, the professionalism, the refusal to compromise, was part of why she trusted me with work this important. I assembled my full team for the proposal process, everyone working together to design a comprehensive transformation strategy that addressed operations, technology, culture, and measurement. We spent 3 weeks building the plan, testing every assumption, stress testing every projection, making sure we could deliver on every commitment. The presentation to the conglomerate's executive leadership was scheduled for November 15th in their Chicago headquarters, and I flew the whole team up the night before so we'd be fresh and prepared. In the hotel that evening, I gathered everyone in my suite and talked about what this moment meant, not just for the firm, but for each of us individually. I told them we'd won this opportunity through competence, integrity, and mutual respect, and that we'd execute it the same way. No shortcuts, no politics, no one taking credit for someone else's work. We'd succeed together or fail together, but we'd do it honestly. The presentation the next morning lasted 4 hours, with breaks for questions and deep dives into methodology. The conglomerate's CEO was a man named Raymond Torres, late 50s, who'd built his career on operational excellence and had no patience for consultants who promised more than they could deliver. He challenged every assumption, questioned every cost projection, asked what would happen if key variables changed or timelines shifted. I answered each question with data, showed him our track record, walked him through case studies that proved we could execute at scale without sacrificing quality. When he asked about my background and why I'd started my own firm, I told him the truth. I'd left a corporate consulting environment where management failures compromised my ability to serve clients effectively, and I'd built this practice around the principle that documentation, transparency, and respect produced better outcomes than politics and ego. Raymond studied me for a long moment, then asked what I'd learned from that experience. I said I'd learned that your reputation was built through hundreds of small decisions, how you treated people when no one was watching, whether you documented your work even when it seemed unnecessary, whether you told the truth even when lying was easier. I said I'd learned that power without accountability was destructive, and that the most sustainable success came from making other people better instead of making yourself look good. He nodded slowly, glanced at his CFO, and said he'd built his career on similar principles. 2 days later, his head of operations called to say we'd won the contract, that they'd been impressed with our substance over flash, and that they looked forward to a long partnership. The news hit the industry press within a week. A relatively unknown firm winning a $42 million transformation contract from a national conglomerate, with the founder being a black consultant who'd left a major firm only 18 months earlier. Forbes ran a profile piece asking how I'd built a practice so quickly, and I told them the same thing I'd told Raymond: documentation, transparency, and respect for everyone's contributions. The reporter asked about my former firm and what had prompted my departure, and I gave a carefully worded answer about wanting more direct client relationships and operational autonomy. I didn't mention Pritchard, didn't mention the voicemail or the investigation, because the story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about what I'd built after escaping a toxic situation. The reporter seemed disappointed that I wouldn't provide more drama, but she wrote a fair piece that focused on my growth trajectory and the principles behind my success. In December, I received an invitation to speak at a national consulting conference about building client relationships through transparency and accountability. The invitation came from the conference organizers who'd read the Forbes article and wanted me to share practical lessons with an audience of senior consultants and firm leaders. I accepted, and when I took the stage in January, I looked out at 500 professionals and told them about a Saturday morning in a barber shop where my barber had played me a voicemail that changed my life. I didn't name Pritchard or my former firm, just described the situation abstractly: a manager planning to destroy a junior analyst through false accusations, and the analyst's decision to let documentation tell the truth. I walked them through the methodology: version-controlled spreadsheets, time-stamped approvals, archived communications, systematic evidence gathering. I explained how that discipline had not only protected me but had built the foundation for everything I'd accomplished since. The audience was silent through most of the talk, and when I finished, the applause was sustained and genuine. During the Q&A, multiple people asked variations of the same question: how do you maintain that level of documentation discipline without becoming paranoid or cynical? I told them it wasn't about paranoia. It was about professionalism, about treating every project like it might be audited, every decision like it might need to be explained, every relationship like it needed to be built on verifiable trust rather than assumed goodwill. I said the people who felt threatened by documentation were usually the people who had something to hide, and the people who appreciated it were the people worth working with. The audience nodded, and I saw recognition in their faces, like they'd all experienced versions of what I'd described. After the conference, I flew back to Atlanta and drove directly to Derek's barbershop. It was a Saturday, exactly like the Saturday when this had all started, and Derek was working through his usual roster of clients. When my turn came, I sat in the chair and he asked what I wanted. I told him just a cleanup, same as always, and while he worked I told him about the contract, the speaking invitation, the way everything had unfolded. Derek listened, smiled, and said he'd always known I had it in me, that he'd just helped me see what was already there. When he finished and I stood to pay, I handed him an envelope along with the cash for the cut. Inside was a check for $10,000 and a handwritten note that said, "For the voicemail that saved my career. This doesn't cover what you gave me, but it's a start. Thank you for pressing play." Derek opened the envelope, read the note, looked at the check, and tried to hand it back. I told him no, that he'd made a choice that Saturday to show me something that could have gotten him in trouble with a client, that he'd risked his own business relationship to protect someone from his community, and that deserved recognition. He was quiet for a moment, then folded the envelope carefully and put it in his pocket. He said the money would help, that he'd been thinking about expanding the shop and this would get him started, but that the real payment was seeing me win. We shook hands, and I walked out of that barbershop for what felt like the 100th time, but this time knowing I'd closed the circle completely. The year ended with my firm hitting $8.3 million in revenue, 24 employees, and active projects with 14 major clients across 6 states. I'd paid myself a salary that was 5 times what I'd made at my former firm, distributed bonuses to every employee based on performance, and invested in infrastructure that would support growth to 50 employees within 2 years. My father came to Atlanta for New Year's and toured the main office, met my team, saw what I'd built. He didn't say much, just nodded approvingly and told me he was proud, which was all I needed to hear. That evening, we had dinner at my apartment, and he asked me if I felt like I'd gotten revenge on the manager who'd tried to destroy me. I thought about the question carefully before answering. I told him revenge wasn't the right word, because revenge implied I'd done something to hurt Pritchard beyond letting the truth surface. I said what I'd done was refuse to be erased, document my worth so thoroughly that no one could deny it, and build something better than what I'd lost. Pritchard had destroyed himself through his own incompetence and dishonesty. I just made sure the evidence was visible when people started looking. The real victory wasn't his termination or professional exile, though those felt like justice. The real victory was sitting here in my own apartment, running my own firm, working with clients who valued my expertise, and knowing that I'd built all of it by being exactly who I was: thorough, honest, professional, and unwilling to compromise my standards for someone else's comfort. That wasn't revenge. That was redemption. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Ezra's place? Leave your comment, like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.